Jiro is a young, friendless boy who is upset because all his classmates think he's a weirdo. He is currently venting about his problems and receiving a pep talk, telling him to embrace what's unique about him, but the one giving him this pep talk is his dog. So I kinda see why his friends thought he was weird. It turns out that Jiro was born with the ability to hear the voices of all the animals around him, but talking to animals all the time freaks others out. So by the time Jiro was grown up, the only friends he had were the neighborhood animals, and he'd go to great lengths to keep them safe, even getting into fights to protect some of his animal buddies from the delinquents who were trying to mess with them. After chasing the delinquents off, the cat and crow thank Jiro for his help because those three have been terrorizing them a lot lately, but Jiro says it's no big deal and turns to head home. When he gets back, his grandpa immediately yells at him because he can tell that Jiro got into a fight again. He tells Jiro he didn't teach him the techniques of the shinobi just so he could go around beating people up in the neighborhood. He tells Jiro he's making a mockery of their family name, but Jiro says he couldn't care less about their stupid family name, and that sends his grandpa into a blind rage. So he takes out the family heirloom katana and starts chasing Jiro around. A little while later, the old man finally calms down, so he and Jiro are busy putting the doors back together, but Grandpa's got a community meeting to attend. So he tells Jiro he has to leave and that he will be back late, so he asks Jiro to lock up before going to bed. Jiro curses under his breath but agrees to his request. However, a moment later, that crow from earlier comes looking for Jiro and asks him for help because there's a cat in trouble in the woods. Jiro has no idea what's going on, but he follows the crow, and when he arrives at the location, he finds a cat severely injured under a tree. This is the first time either Jiro or the crow have seen this cat around here, and they have no idea what happened to it, but it looks like it's still breathing, so Jiro decides to do everything he can to save it. It turns out that before this point, the cat was a being known as Rago, the Devourer of the Sun, and he had been summoned by a mysterious group who sought to use his power for themselves. But Rago refused to take orders from them, so his summoners attempted to kill him for it. The next time Rago opens his eyes, he finds himself in a warm cat bed back at Jiro's house, and a moment later, Jiro comes in to check on him. Jiro is glad to see that the cat is finally awake because, with how badly injured it was, he wasn't sure if it would pull through or not. He brought the cat a bowl of water since he assumed it would probably be thirsty, and he then introduces himself, asking the cat to introduce itself as well. Dago thinks Jiro must be an idiot because even if he did tell him his name, there's no way a human would be able to understand the words of a cat, but Jiro tells him it's not nice to call people idiots for no reason. Finding out that Jiro can understand him comes as such a shock to Dago that he runs under the bed and refuses to come out because he doesn't understand what's going on. Jiro can understand why Dago would be startled if he has never spoken to a human before, but he assures him that he's not in any danger here. However, Dago isn't so easily convinced. He doesn't sense any spiritual energy coming from Jiro, so he's sure Jiro really is a human, but just to be safe, he decides to stay hidden there until he can find an opening to escape. However, a moment later, Jiro comes out with some food, and all Dago's earlier caution goes out the window because he's really hungry. Jiro finds it amusing how easy it was to get Rago to cave, but Rago shows no shame and says no hungry man would pass up a meal. Jiro also thinks it's funny that a cat is calling itself a man, but Rago flares up and tells Jiro he is not a cat. He formally introduces himself as an immortal, or what is more commonly known here as a Mononoke. Mononoke often take the forms of humans or animals and blend into their surroundings without people finding out, and Jiro doesn't really get it. But if Mononoke are meant to be such powerful creatures, then he asks how Rago ended up like this in the first place. Rago explains that it was another Mononoke that did this to him, and when Jiro asks why it happened, Rago says he isn't exactly sure of the details because he can't remember everything, but he recalls that it was another Mononoke that did this to him, and the reason they attacked was because they wanted his assistance with something, and he refused. Jiro is starting to understand what went down, because it sounds like, after Rago turned these guys down, they jumped him. Though Jiro doesn't really understand why Rago turned them down in the first place, since he assumed that, as a Mononoke, he would want to help out one of his own. However, Rago says he absolutely hates people like that guy because they are just parasites who want to act tough but can do nothing but rely on the power of others. Rago doesn't really think there's a point in telling Jiro all of this, since, as a human, he probably doesn't believe a word he just said. But Jiro reminds him that he's talking to a kid who has been able to speak to animals all his life, so immortal monsters existing isn't all too surprising to him. Meanwhile, out in the forest, a female agent has just come across the spot where Jiro first found Rago, and she reports back to HQ that she found a pool of blood which she has confirmed belongs to Rago. but she's not picking up any of his spiritual presence, so he must have gone into hiding nearby. Her boss tells her to wait for the rest of the search team to arrive for now, so she agrees to pull back and vanishes into the trees. It looks like there was someone else in the forest looking for traces of Rago besides her. At the same time, back at Jiro's house, he is busy giving Rago a bath to unwind, and he is impressed by how quickly Rago's injuries have all healed because he looks almost as good as new now. Bathing Rago like this reminds Jiro of how he used to do the same with his dog, Nachi, back in the day. She was the biggest, fluffiest dog a guy could ask for, and whenever he would get bullied or hurt, she would always ask him to give her a bath because she knew that always calmed him down. Later that night, Jiro goes to bed, but the second Rago thinks he's asleep, he climbs out onto the windowsill and prepares to leave. He didn't want to have to leave like this since he owes Jiro big time for saving his life, but if he stays here any longer, then he's going to end up putting Jiro in danger. He then jumps out the window, but as he lands, he ends up wobbling a little because although his injuries may have healed, he hasn't regained his full strength yet. He is about to leave the compound, but all of a sudden, Jiro appears behind him and asks Rago where he thinks he's going this late at night. Rago is shocked because he could have sworn he saw Jiro sleeping upstairs, but Jiro had anticipated that Rago might pull something like this, so he set up a dummy illusion in his bed to trick him. Cheap tricks aside, Rago tells him he doesn't need to concern himself with his affairs anymore because he has already done more than enough, but Jiro refuses to accept that and reminds Rago that he's the one who saved his life, so Rago is his responsibility until he is fully recovered. Rago tells Jiro that he never asked him for his help, and in fact, he would have been perfectly fine with dying out there if Jiro hadn't shown up. Jiro keeps arguing with him, but Rago eventually loses patience and reminds Jiro that he is still a Mononoke, a human-eating monster, and it is in Jiro's best interest to just go back to bed and pretend they never met. But all of a sudden, a random guy walks into Jiro's compound and interrupts them. Jiro has no idea who this guy is, but he tells him to get out of here because he wasn't invited. However, the man calls Jiro an ignorant human and transforms his arm before charging at him. This catches Jiro off guard, so he isn't able to react in time. But Rago refuses to let him die like that, so he jumps up and pushes Jiro out of the way before leading the guy out into the forest. He is doing his best to escape, but since he hasn't recovered his strength yet, the demon is easily able to catch up to Rago and pummel him to the ground in no time. He tells Rago that it's not too late to stop and agree to help his side because they put a lot of effort into breaking the seal that kept Rago imprisoned, and they'd hate to have to kill him for not cooperating, but Rago scoffs in his face and tells him that if he wants his power so bad, then he's going to have to risk his life to come get it. The demon then charges at Rago with full force, but before he could hit him, Jiro comes out of nowhere with his family katana and slashes the demon across the arm. Rago can't believe Jiro actually came back and calls him a fool for wasting the opportunity he bought him to escape, but Jiro says he couldn't just leave Rago to die out here to that thing. And besides, if the demon actually did manage to kill Rago, it probably would have come back for Jiro as well, so this was the best option he had. The demon fully transforms and prepares to attack Jiro, but he does find it rather surprising that Jiro isn't fazed at all by his monstrous appearance. He also notices the patterns on the katana and the stealth abilities Jiro showed earlier, and he surmises that Jiro must be one of the shinobi. The demon then charges at him and throws a punch, but although it was sure it had hit him, when it looks at its fist, all it sees is a piece of cloth, because Jiro had actually dodged and was preparing to attack from above. However, while it may have been a good plan, Jiro severely underestimated just how fast the monster really is, because before he could hit it, it had already flashed step behind him and stabbed Jiro through the back with its finger. Jiro attempted to get off one final attack on the demon, but it leapt back to dodge it, and it's impressed that he could even think of attacking with a wound like that, but it doesn't matter now because there's no way Jiro can survive something like that. Rago walks up to Jiro and looks at his dying body with guilt because he knows this would never have happened to Jiro if it weren't for him. But when the demon sees Rago looking at Jiro like that, he assumes he must be thinking about eating him since eating a human would help Rago regain his full power. He agrees to let Rago have Jiro's body in hopes that it will make him change his mind about offering his assistance, but Rago intends to do no such thing. It's true that eating Jiro would allow him to regain his power, but he owes Jiro too much to do that to him or let him die here. So instead, Rago decides to let Jiro eat him. He then transforms and flies into Jiro's body, releasing a large amount of energy as Rago's true power is finally released, and the demon can't believe that Rago would actually betray Mononoke kind like this and hand his power over to a human. Jiro regains consciousness as his wounds are healed with Rago's power, but he has no idea what's going on, and he is startled by all the dark smoke coming out of his body. Just then, he hears Rago's voice in his head, telling him to stop messing around and pay attention because they are still in the middle of a fight. The demon attacks Jiro again, but this time, Jiro's body is fast enough to dodge his attacks, and he manages to avoid being impaled a second time. However, he has no idea how to actually take the demon down. But that's where Rago comes in. He tells Jiro that all he needs to do is make a fist, and he will handle the rest for him. Jiro doesn't really understand what that's supposed to mean, but he goes along with it, and as he throws a punch, Rago uses his energy to blow a hole straight through the demon's torso, killing it in one hit. Jiro is still in disbelief about everything that just happened, but before he could even take a moment to think things through, he is suddenly surrounded by agents from the Espionage Bureau who came here in response to the spiritual disturbance, and he is knocked out so he can be taken in for questioning. The next thing Jiro knows, he finds himself in a hospital bed with the girl who knocked him out standing right next to him, and once she realizes Jiro is awake, she gives a quick call to her chief to let him know Jiro is conscious again. Jiro still has no idea who she is, so he asks what's going on, and Rago pops out of his chest to say he's just as confused as Jiro is right now. Just then, Ichika notices Rago sitting on Jiro's head, and Jiro finally realizes it a moment later, so he starts yelling at Rago to get off him. And a moment later, Ichika's boss finally arrives to check on Jiro. He says he's glad to see that Jiro seems perfectly fine, and he also asks Rago how he's doing, but Rago doesn't feel like talking to him right now. Mild animosity aside, Ryosuke is surprised by how calm Rago is, because he was expecting him to be a lot more confrontational than he is now. Ryosuke introduces himself as the head of the Mononoke division and Ichika as his subordinate, and since Jiro wants an explanation about everything that's going on right now, Ryo decides to start by asking him if he knows about the Oniwaban, and Jiro remembers learning a bit about them. From what he recalls, they were undercover agents who worked for the Edo shogunate, and Ryo adds that as time went on, the Oniwaban moved on from service to the shogunate and now serve the modern government as the Bureau of Espionage. They do a bunch of things, including gathering information, going undercover, and, of course, finding and destroying Mononoke. That's why there's a whole department dedicated to dealing with Mononoke incidents, and Ryo has had it easy for a while since Mononoke usually don't cause much trouble. However, lately, things have been getting really hectic since their facility was attacked by a group of Mononoke, and during that attack, Rago, who was sealed in the facility, was released. All that said, Ryo still isn't sure how exactly Rago and Jiro ended up like that, so he asks Jiro to enlighten him. Jiro explains the whole thing, and Ichika immediately starts calling him an idiot for saving a Mononoke with no plan, but Jiro doesn't want to hear that kind of criticism from someone he doesn't know. Ryo tells Ichika to calm down because the fact of the matter is that Jiro is completely fused with Rago, and unless they do something, he's going to stay that way forever. However, they have no idea how to undo it, and they also have no idea what the other Mononoke may be planning, so Ryo says they'll be taking Jiro into protective custody. Jiro tries to object, but Ryo tells him he doesn't really have a choice in the matter. He clarifies that they aren't heroes of justice or anything like that, so they are under no obligation to preserve Jiro's personal rights. They've already filled out a missing persons report for when they transport Jiro to a different facility tomorrow morning, but for now, Ryo tells him to just get some rest. He also mentions that there are guards stationed outside his door, and he says they are there to protect Jiro in case anything happens, but Jiro knows they are most likely just there to make sure he doesn't escape. Jiro is a little worried since if he gets taken away, there's a good chance he will never get to see his grandpa again. And a situation like this is precisely why Rago kept telling him that getting involved with him would only cause him trouble. Jiro says he really isn't in the mood for a lecture right now, but Rago says he isn't trying to lecture. He just wants Jiro to understand the full picture of what's happening here. Those two may have promised that everything happening right now is for Jiro's protection, but they were also the same people who sealed Rago away in the first place. So Rago finds it hard to believe that they just let Jiro live normally after he has fused with a Mononoke. And on top of that, there's those Mononoke who broke into the facility to release Rago in the first place. If they were willing to cause trouble with the Bureau to get to Rago, they aren't going to give up so easily, so they'll be sure to come after Jiro as well, and that pretty much means Jiro has to figure out what to do on his own. This whole thing has really given Jiro a lot to think about, and he decides he's not going to care about what anyone else says and do what he wants from now on. First things first, he tells Rago they've got to get out of here, and Rago is surprised to hear that because he didn't think Jiro had anywhere to run to at this point. But Jiro says he doesn't plan on running. He just needs to get a few things done, and after that, he's just going to have to accept whatever happens. Rago has no idea what Jiro is thinking, but he warns him that there's no guarantee that everything will be fine if he goes through with this, and he can't rely on Rago to save him. But Jiro says he will figure things out on his own somehow. As he says this, he notices a group of crows outside, and that gives him an idea. So, while the guards are still busy watching the door, he suddenly starts making a lot of noise to draw their attention, and once they come in to check on him, Jiro tells the crows to attack them to buy him enough time to escape. Rago is surprised by how well that worked, but Jiro never had a doubt because those crows are his friends, and if he asks for help, they'll do anything he asks. Once Jiro has made it far enough away from the hospital, he thanks the crows for helping him and gives them a bag of snacks as a reward for their effort. But although Jiro did manage to make it out of the hospital, Rago asks him what he's going to do now since the Bureau is probably already looking for him. Jiro says he really isn't too worried about that right now since there's just one thing he wants to do first. A little while later, Jiro returns to his house, and Rago finally understands why Jiro wanted to escape so badly, because even if the Bureau was going to take him away, he wanted to at least explain things to his grandpa beforehand. After all, he wouldn't want to leave his grandpa thinking that he really did go missing. He stands outside for a while trying to think of how to explain all this to the old man, but all of a sudden, Jiro's grandpa appears behind him, startling Jiro. Jiro begins trying to explain things, but his grandpa tells him to just be quiet and follow him, so that's what Jiro does for now. A little while later, Jiro's grandpa leads him to an open stadium, and Jiro is starting to wonder how much walking they are going to be doing since he really doesn't have much time before the Bureau finds him, and he'd like to talk to his grandpa before that. He also asks why his grandpa brought him to a field in the first place anyway, and his grandpa says he came here so no one else would interfere, right before punching Jiro square in the face. Jiro falls to the ground and asks his grandpa what that was for, but his grandpa simply yells at him and calls him an idiot for not knowing the severity of what he has done. Jiro has no idea what he's talking about, but his grandpa says Ryo already told him everything, including how Jiro is currently possessed by a Mononoke. He probably wouldn't have believed it if he hadn't seen it for himself, but the fact that Rago is right there is definitive proof that the story is true. Jiro is shocked that his grandpa knows about all this stuff, but that's because the old man is a former member of the Bureau of Espionage. He hates that it has come to this, but the old man knows what he must do now. He intends to take responsibility for Jiro's mistake, and to do that, he is going to kill both Jiro and Rago so neither the Bureau nor the Mononoke can exploit them, and after that, he is going to kill himself to atone. Jiro tries to tell his grandpa to calm down, but the old man has nothing more to say, so he charges straight at Jiro with a devastating axe kick. Jiro just barely manages to evade his attack, but he has never seen his grandpa this mad before, and in the next moment, he gets speed blitz and knocked to the ground. His grandpa explains that their Azuma family techniques have been perfected to fight both man and Mononoke alike, but he only ever got to teach Jiro the basics for the sake of self-defense. He thinks it's a shame that Jiro will never get to reach his true potential now, but he wants to ensure that Jiro will never have to suffer the cruelties of the Mononoke world, and to that end, he promises to make Jiro's death as swift and painless as possible. However, just before he could strike Jiro, Rago suddenly steps in and blocks the punch for him, knocking Jiro's grandpa away. Rago tells Jiro to snap out of his daze and take this seriously because his grandpa is really trying to kill him. But despite all that, Jiro still tells Rago to stay out of this and not to come out until he tells him to, because he wants to handle this by himself. Rago doesn't quite understand why Jiro is refusing his help, since he's clearly no match for his grandpa. But if that's what Jiro really wants, then he isn't going to interfere. Looking at Jiro now, his grandpa is reminded of how, when Jiro was younger, he one day climbed into a massive tree just so he could save a baby cat, but he didn't even stop for a second to consider whether he'd be able to get back down on his own after saving it. Luckily, he was there to catch Jiro, but he made sure to yell at him for doing something so reckless, because while helping others may indeed be a noble act, he tells Jiro he's going to end up getting himself killed if he keeps putting himself in situations outside his capabilities. He told Jiro that he needed to learn to rely on those around him instead of trying to solve every problem by himself, but Jiro asks what he's supposed to do if there's no one around to help, and his grandpa told him he'd just have to give up. But Jiro didn't want to live like that, so in that case, his grandpa told him he'd just have to grow stronger so that there's no situation he can't handle. Back to the present, Jiro's grandpa tells him that the world of the Mononoke is like nothing he has ever seen before, and if Jiro were forced into it like his grandpa was, then he'd end up killing his fellow man and Mononoke alike, eventually losing himself in the process. It is a gruesome and unforgiving world, and that's why he fought to make sure Jiro would never have to experience it, but it looks like he failed. Jiro apologizes to his grandpa because he's only in this mess because he stuck his nose where he shouldn't have and didn't think things through, but he says he doesn't regret choosing to help, and he's going to figure out a way to clean up his own mess. His grandpa yells, calling Jiro an ignorant fool before charging at him, and Rago tries to warn Jiro to dodge, but Jiro has no intention of moving. He stands there and takes his grandpa's punch head-on, and though he still gets knocked back, he manages to land on his feet. Rago can't believe Jiro just did that, and his grandpa tells him that was a stupid thing to do because he can tell that he did that in an attempt to demonstrate his resolve, but he says that doesn't prove a thing other than the fact that Jiro can take a punch. Jiro had a feeling that wouldn't be enough to convince his grandpa, but he tells him that, for better or worse, he's not alone anymore. So if he can't do it on his own, he can always rely on Rago. He then tells Rago to do the thing, but Rago has no idea what he's talking about and makes Jiro look stupid for trying to act cool just now, so the two start arguing. Seeing this, his grandpa is reminded of what he told Jiro about finding people he can rely on, and simply by looking at those two, although they may be arguing, he can tell that when push comes to shove, Rago would risk his life to protect Jiro, and Jiro would do the same. This makes him realize that Jiro may actually be able to handle himself after all, so he tells the two of them to stop arguing and announces that he is surrendering, so Jiro is free to do whatever he wants, but he still thinks Jiro is a fool for letting this happen. Later that night, they all return home, and Jiro has a nice long soak in the bath to take the edge off after everything that happened today. He also apologizes to Rago for dragging him into this mess and acting selfishly earlier, but Rago says it doesn't bother him that much. He just asks that Jiro rely on him more so he doesn't end up getting hurt as much next time, and Jiro agrees. Although he's got no idea what they'll have to deal with from now on since he's going to have to work with the Bureau of Espionage starting tomorrow. The next morning, Jiro packs a bag with all of his essentials since he knows the Bureau is going to be here to take him away any minute, and Rago asks him if he's sure about going with them so willingly since he has no way of knowing what they might have in store for him, but Jiro says there's no use in worrying about it now since, with the current situation, it's not like he has much of a choice. Even if he tried to run, the Bureau would just keep chasing him, and dragging his grandpa into all of this again is the last thing he wants, so he figures it's better to face whatever comes next head-on. He then heads out to meet up with the agent the Bureau sent to pick him up, but he is shocked to see that the agent who was sent was actually Ichika, and he really doesn't get along well with her. She says she's here to make sure Jiro doesn't escape again like last time, and she then points to the transport truck, telling Jiro he's going to be riding in the back with her until they get to HQ. Jiro really doesn't like that he's going to be stuck with Ichika, but he doesn't have much of a choice, so he says his final goodbyes to his grandpa and gets in the truck. However, he wasn't expecting handcuffs to be slapped onto his wrists the second he got in with Ichika. He asks her if this is really necessary because there's no need to treat him like a prisoner when he's cooperating, but Ichika tells him he pretty much is a prisoner as far as she's concerned because he's no longer fully human. She honestly has no idea why the higher-ups are so keen on keeping him alive, but her job is to make sure Jiro gets there safe and sound, and she's going to take it seriously, even if it means guarding a freak like Jiro. Jiro really doesn't appreciate being called a freak, especially when he was trying to be nice to Ichika since she's a girl, but Ichika takes offense to that statement because she thinks Jiro is looking down on her, so she punches the wall and threatens Jiro to watch what he says around her. But just then, Rago materializes and asks the two if they could keep it down because he's trying to sleep. But that aside, Rago says he's surprised that the Bureau would send a little girl like Ichika to guard them, and he figures they must really be short-handed if they are sending kids into battle like this. Ichika tells Rago to shut up because she doesn't want to hear any criticisms from a Mononoke, but Rago tells her she has bigger problems to worry about because, although she hasn't realized it yet, they are about to get into a lot of trouble here. As Rago says this, the truck drives into some dense fog, and the two drivers are trying to figure out why it suddenly got so foggy, but then this happens, and the truck crashes shortly after. Ichika and Jiro get flung around in the back of the truck as it crashes, and Ichika has no idea what's going on, but she can tell it isn't good, so she tells Jiro to wait in here while she goes to check it out. As she leaves the truck, she is shocked to find out that they are now in a spectral zone, and she has no idea how she didn't realize it before now. But it's too late to worry about that now because, just then, the two Mononoke show themselves. They've already devoured both drivers, and they are clearly after Rago, so Ichika equips her gear and prepares to take them down. First, she tries using good old reliable, a gun, but unfortunately, bullets have no effect on the big guy, and the smaller one is too fast for her to shoot, so she is forced to switch to her melee weapon to defend herself. The small one knocks her backward into the big one, but Ichika manages to reposition herself with her knife and slash across the big one's arms as she dodges its punch. However, even though she was able to slash it multiple times, none of the slashes went very deep because its body is extremely dense. She realizes she's not going to be able to damage that one with the weapons she has on hand right now, and the other one's speed is a real problem as well because the second Ichika gets distracted, it sneaks up behind her and smacks her into the side of the truck. Jiro sees the dent from inside, and he wonders what's going on out there since he thought they were just meant to be heading to the bureau. But Rago explains that Ichika is probably getting attacked by a Mononoke right now, and by the sound of things out there, she's getting her ass beaten. Jiro is surprised and asks how that's possible, so Rago explains that while he and Ichika were arguing, the truck must have slipped into a spectral zone. Jiro doesn't know what spectral zones are, so Rago explains that it's pretty much a dimension entirely separate from the mortal world, otherwise known as the realm of the Mononoke. He adds that humans can sometimes wander into one by accident, but getting out isn't always easy once they've crossed over. Jiro still doesn't really get it, but it doesn't matter right now because, from the sound of things out there, Ichika is going to die if he doesn't do something to help her soon, so he asks Rago to help him get these handcuffs off. However, Rago says he can't do that. Those handcuffs are made of a special material that negates all spiritual energy, so Rago isn't capable of destroying them in his current state. Jiro is starting to get really frustrated, so he decides he's just going to go out there and force Ichika to take the handcuffs off him herself so he can help. However, Rago tells him he might be better off just letting it play out. After all, just like the Mononoke, the Bureau is simply trying to take him so they can use him for their own personal gain, so it would be in his best interest to just let them keep fighting and escape while he can. Rago's reasoning makes sense, but at the end of the day, the facts of the matter are that Ichika is currently fighting to protect Jiro, even if it's just because of orders, and Jiro isn't the kind of guy who'd just sit by and watch someone die protecting him, even if she's pretty rude, so he's going to help her. Just then, the big Mononoke ends up punching the van, which sends Jiro flying out onto the grass, and when the Mononoke see him, they recognize Jiro as the target they were sent here to collect. Their orders are to bring him back alive, so they tell him that if he surrenders, they won't hurt him. But Jiro completely ignores them and starts yelling at Ichika to hurry up and unlock these handcuffs so he can help, but to his surprise, she refuses because she says she'd never want to work with a Mononoke like him. Just then, the two Mononoke attack, so Jiro and Ichika are forced to dodge backward, and Jiro tells Ichika to get over her petty bias and let him help because if she doesn't, they're both going to end up dying here. As he says this, Ichika is reminded of the day they held her mother's funeral after she died at the hands of a Mononoke, and from that day on, Ichika swore she would do everything in her power to become strong, just like her mother would have wanted. She wants to believe she can handle this on her own, but the reality is that she can't, and Jiro tells her that if she doesn't want her mission to end in failure, then she has to be willing to do whatever it takes to win, even if that means working with him. She hesitates for a brief moment, knowing everything she has believed since childhood is telling her to refuse, but she also knows Jiro is right. Ichika finally agrees to let Jiro help and shatters his handcuffs, and the second Jiro is free, he leaps into the air and calls on Rago for some help, allowing him to one-shot the big Mononoke, and while the other one was frozen in disbelief at the death of its friend, Ichika snuck up behind it and diced it into pieces. But unfortunately, Jiro jumped a little too high with that first jump, so he ends up crashing to the ground. When he gets back up, Ichika stands off to the side and tells him she's not going to be thanking him for this, but Jiro says he didn't do it for any thanks. Ichika fought to protect him, so he did the same for her, and that makes them even, and this whole thing has made Ichika's opinion of Jiro a lot better. However, they still have a bit of a problem to deal with since the transport truck was destroyed, so Jiro asks Ichika what they are supposed to do now, and Ichika tells him they are just going to have to walk the rest of the way. Meanwhile, Ryosuke is currently in a meeting with the higher-ups, and he is basically trying to convince them to allow him to establish a team with Jiro and Rago as members. The council members think that's a terrible idea at first, but Ryo explains that Rago has yet to show any hostility toward them, and he seems to be cooperating with Jiro at the moment, so it should be possible to work with him. Additionally, it's pretty clear that the enemy is after him, so rather than condemning Jiro and Rago to a cell, he thinks it'd be better if they get the chance to work in the field and sharpen their skills, so the enemy won't be able to snatch them up so easily. He also points out that keeping Jiro locked away won't solve anything because their enemies will continue targeting him regardless, and if that happens, it'd be better for Jiro to have actual combat experience instead of spending all his time behind bars. Ryo also promises to take full responsibility for what happens to Jiro and Rago from now on, and his proposal was rather persuasive, so the higher-ups agree to let him do what he wants. The next day, Jiro is out by the dock brushing his teeth, thinking about how crazy the past week was because one moment he was just living a normal life, but the next thing he knew, he found a weird cat, got killed by a giant ogre, and now here he is, working for a strange organization. Just then, Ryo comes over to ask Jiro how he's adjusting to his new life. But Jiro doesn't think this is much of a new life since they've already run all sorts of tests on him since he got here, and he hasn't had a single minute to himself yet. And on top of that, he still can't believe that this is really the base of operations that Ryo was talking about. Ryo explains that every division in the Bureau has its own base of operations, and it has to blend in with the surroundings, so they usually opt for office buildings or shrines and stuff, but unfortunately, the second division got stuck with a shipping yard, and since Jiro is one of them now, that means he's stuck with it too. Just then, a car pulls up to the base, and a young woman gets out, so Jiro asks who this is, and Ryo explains that this is Hana Usumi, and she is going to be the assistant chief of this team, and the other guy who gets out of the car and immediately starts flirting with Usami is Reiji Kirihara. Ryo formally introduces everyone inside, and he hopes they'll all get along, but Jiro and Ichika still don't get along very well. Reiji, on the other hand, is a master of conversation, and within a few minutes of talking to Ichika, he manages to compliment her so much that she starts blushing. However, when it comes to Jiro, he has nothing but unfiltered disgust for a half-human, half-Mononoke hybrid like him, and Jiro isn't the kind of person who just sit there and let himself be insulted, so he gets up in Reiji's face and asks him if he's looking for a fight, and Reiji says he'd love to beat Jiro up if that's what he wants. Ichika tries calming things down since she doesn't want these two to actually get into a fight, but Ryo, on the other hand, is more than happy to see the fight happen, and he even gets Usami to pull out a camera so they can record it. Aside from thinking this would be fun to watch, Ryo is also doing it because they still need to test what Jiro's limits are and how strong he really is. Otherwise, they won't be able to make effective use of him in the field. Usami then begins the recording, and Ryo gives the signal for them to start fighting. After that, Jiro asks Ryo why Reiji is allowed to use a sword during their fight. Ryo explains that Reiji comes from a long line of legendary swordsmen who find it difficult to part with their swords, even in combat. However, he tells Jiro that if he thinks it's unfair, he's free to grab a sword of his own. Jiro simply responds that he won't need one. Reiji then tells Jiro that he's free to use his secret weapon, and when he says that, he is referring to Rago who's sitting on his shoulders. But Jiro calls Reiji a dumbass for thinking Rago is some kind of weapon. He explains that this is supposed to be a fight between the two of them, and nobody else is going to interfere, and that includes Rago. Rago agrees to let Jiro handle this on his own, and since there's nothing else for him to do right now, he decides to go back to sleep. Seeing this, Reiji then drops his sword and turns around because clearly thinks Jiro is too weak to fight him properly, so he decides to give him a handicap instead. He tells Jiro that he can attack whenever he wants, and he even promises to keep his eyes closed while doing it. Hearing that immediately pisses Jiro off, so he charges straight at Reiji before suddenly leaping into the air. Usami assumes Jiro jumped so Reiji wouldn't be able to use the sound of his footsteps to judge exactly how far away he was. But Ryo doesn't think such a simple trick is going to work on someone like Reiji. A skilled swordsman like Reiji doesn't rely on simple things like distance or sound to fight. Even when those senses are taken away, experienced swordsmen can rely on their sixth sense to detect their opponent's movements. A moment later, Reiji proves Ryo right because the second Jiro gets within range, he suddenly picks up his sword and strikes Jiro at exactly the right moment, sending him flying backwards. After that, Reiji prepares to walk away and tells Ryo they should probably end the fight here since he wouldn't want to accidentally kill Jiro by hitting him too much. But just as he's about to leave, Jiro gets back on his feet and tells him that the fight is only getting started because he barely felt that strike, and Reiji admits that if nothing else, Jiro's resilience is praiseworthy. The two charge at each other once again, but just as they're about to collide, Jiro suddenly shatters Reiji's sword. He then slips behind him and lands a powerful punch right across his face. Ryo is completely impressed by what he just witnessed because he never expected Jiro to pull off something like that. Meanwhile, Reiji is left lying on the ground, trying to understand how Jiro managed to shatter his sword so easily. Jiro asks if he's finally ready to give up, but Reiji simply gets back to his feet and tells him that the fight is only just beginning for him as well. The two continue battling while Ichika asks Ryo if he really thinks this fight will be enough to convince the higher-ups. Ryo confirms that it will. He explains that this battle is the perfect opportunity to test their toughness and determination, allowing the higher-ups to see exactly how much they can endure and how far they're willing to push themselves. A few hours later, Reiji wakes up and sees Jiro sitting beside a truck. He asks where everyone else went, but Jiro has no idea since he says he just woke up a few minutes before Reiji did. Jiro then tosses him a can of soda, and since both of them passed out, Reiji thinks they should count this as a draw, but then again, Jiro did manage to wake up first, so the victory should technically go to him. However, Jiro says Reiji should be the one to claim victory, because if Reiji had really wanted to, he probably could have killed Jiro with his first strike. And Jiro's trick of breaking Reiji's sword only worked because they were using wooden swords, and if it had been a real blade, Jiro knows he would have lost his arm pulling a stunt like that, which is why he thinks Reiji deserves the win instead. Hearing that makes Reiji think Jiro has finally decided to act mature for a change, but the moment he opens the can of soda, it explodes all over his face because Jiro had shaken the hell out of it specifically to prank Jiro. Meanwhile, Usumi asks Ryo if he thinks the recording of Jiro and Reiji's fight will be enough to convince the higher-ups. Ryo tells her not to worry because the video was never meant to convince anyone of anything. The real tests will begin tomorrow when they head into the field. Usami still thinks it's too early to send Jiro and Reiji on a real mission, but Ryo disagrees. He believes there's no better experience than actual fieldwork, and if everything goes according to plan, they might finally uncover the identity of their true enemy. A little while later, Jiro and the others put on their new uniforms. Ryo admits they actually look pretty cool before telling them to press the button on their wrists. They all do as instructed, and their combat suits instantly transform back into their normal clothes. Jiro then double taps the button, causing his body to become semi-permeable. Ryo explains that the ability comes with a major drawback. Every time they use it, the suit's efficiency drops, so they should only activate it when absolutely necessary. About an hour later, the group arrives at a shrine, and they stop for a little while to pray and ward off any evil spirits, but Jiro still has no idea what any of this has to do with their mission. Reiji then points out that, if he had to guess, the shrine is probably one of the Bureau's facilities, and he's totally right. As they head toward the shrine office, Jiro notices a mysterious hooded man casually chomping away at a Snickers bar. However, he doesn't have much time to think about him because he quickly catches up with everyone else. That's when they run into a problem. Ryo completely forgot to make an appointment. Fortunately, he manages to sweet-talk his way into getting them access to the facility. It isn't long before they discover a hidden staircase, and the group heads deep underground until they arrive at the 7th Reality Sanctum. Ryo explains that this is the exact place where Rago was sealed away. The entire area is made from a rare type of rock known as obsidian, and this location contains the largest deposit of obsidian ever discovered. Ryo decides to split everyone up and says he and Ichika will question potential witnesses, while Jiro and Reiji stay behind and investigate what happened to Reigo on the day he was sealed away. As Ryo and Ichika leave, Ichika wonders if it's really a good idea to leave Jiro and Reiji alone together, but Ryo feels they'll probably work better without the two of them around. Meanwhile, Jiro asks Reigo why he was sealed inside the obsidian in the first place. Reigo honestly admits that he can't remember. Reiji explains that when a Mononoke is sealed away, it's essentially forced to possess another object. The process consumes all of its energy, leaving it completely incapable of breaking the seal on its own. Normally, Mononoke reside inside living beings, but sealing one away forces it to inhabit an inanimate object instead. To a Mononoke, that's basically the equivalent of an eternal punishment. Reiji can't say exactly how long Rago remained trapped inside the obsidian, but he does know one thing. Rago was incredibly lucky to escape with nothing worse than amnesia. He then asks Rago to explain everything he remembers about the day he was freed and who he was with at the time. Meanwhile, Ryo and Ichika arrive at the control room, only to discover that all the security footage has been completely wiped. Ryo questions the man in charge and asks who was on duty that night. The man explains that the two staff members assigned to the control room had mysteriously disappeared before the commotion even started. After gathering all the information they can, Ryo steps outside to light a cigar. The more he thinks about everything they've discovered, the stranger the entire crime scene feels. With that in mind, he and Ichika decide to head back and regroup with the others. Meanwhile, Rago finally starts recalling everything he can remember about the day he was freed. He remembers waking up to the cold touch of stone beneath him, while the air around him was stale and thick with the smell of mold. He could barely move, but somehow managed to force his eyes open just enough to see several Mononokes standing around him, along with a strange man speaking through a tablet. After hearing that, Reiji assumes the mysterious man must have been the ringleader of the entire group. Rago then recalls how the ringleader tried to convince him to join their side. He wanted Rago to lend them his power so they could show those pathetic humans just how powerful the Mononoke truly were. However, Rago had absolutely no interest in joining them, so he simply told the ringleader to go to hell. Shortly afterwards, the ringleader disappeared in a flash of light, giving Rago the perfect opportunity to escape. After hearing Rago's story, Jiro points out that they're basically back at square one. They still don't know who their enemy is or what they're planning. However, Reiji disagrees and explains that they've actually learned three very important things. First, the group that released Rago clearly knows how to break the seal that was placed on him. Second, the ringleader almost certainly knew Rago long before all of this happened. And finally, whoever they're dealing with appears to be seeking revenge against humanity and the Bureau of Espionage for some unknown reason. Jiro quickly tells Reiji to stop because that's already way too much information for him to process. Even so, he's starting to piece everything together. He realizes that he somehow became fused with Rago, and now they've learned that their enemy knows how to undo that fusion. Rago lost his memories after being released, yet the ringleader already knew who he was, which means the two of them must have been connected long before Rago was ever freed. After thinking it over, Jiro decides the solution is actually pretty simple. All he has to do is beat up anyone who gets in his way until the problem is solved. Reiji immediately starts scolding him, calling the plan reckless and stupid. He can't believe Jiro is seriously planning to charge into danger without thinking anything through first, but before their argument can continue, Jiro suddenly notices someone standing behind them. It's the same mysterious hooded man they saw earlier at the shrine, and he's still casually eating his candy like nothing's wrong. Jiro barely has time to react before the mysterious man suddenly vanishes, and in the blink of an eye, he appears directly behind both Jiro and Reiji. His movements are so unbelievably fast that neither of them can even perceive him, and just as quickly as he appeared, the hooded man moves away again, leaving both of them stunned by his incredible speed. The man then slowly removes his hood, and looks directly at Rago to tell him that he's not going to let these two meatheads ruin their reunion. The moment they hear those words, Jiro and Reiji immediately realize what they're dealing with. The mysterious man is a Mononoke. Without wasting another second, the two instantly transform into their combat suits and prepare for battle. After witnessing the man's overwhelming speed firsthand, they know they're about to face an incredibly dangerous opponent. Meanwhile, Ryo and Ichika run into a completely different problem. They suddenly realize they've been trapped outside by an incredibly powerful barrier. It's so strong that even Ryo has no idea how they're supposed to break through it and get back inside. He starts searching for a solution, but nothing immediately comes to mind. The situation is already far more complicated than they expected, especially now that Jiro and Reiji are trapped inside with a dangerous Mononoke. Just as Ryo is trying to figure out their next move, he suddenly notices someone approaching from behind. It's none other than Toko Kusumi, the chief of special operations. The moment Ryo sees her, a confident smirk spreads across his face. Their very first mission was already turning into a complete mess, but now that the chief herself has arrived, he can't help but think that this first mission is about to get even more interesting. The Mononoke introduces himself as Koga, and he says he's going to be the future overlord of all the Mononoke, but to do that, he's going to need Rago. Reiji thinks he must be some kind of idiot because there's no way he really came here with such a dumb goal. He decides to try his luck and asks Koga why he needs Rago so much in hopes of getting him to start monologuing. And Koga takes the bait because he starts explaining that Rago is really special as far as Mononoke go. Most Mononoke are practically immortal, but they need to feed periodically. Otherwise, their spectral forms will deteriorate with time. However, Rago is completely different. He can survive whether he eats or doesn't eat, so he is pretty much an infinite spirit energy generator, and if Koga takes that kind of power for himself, he will be able to become the top Mononoke. After he says that, Reiji and Jiro get into battle stances since they can tell that he's about to attack, but they still have no answer for Koga's sheer speed, so Reiji gets knocked away. And Koga pins Jiro to the ground and tells him to stay out and shut up because, as far as he's concerned, he's just an unnecessary meatbag. And once he manages to get Rago out of him, he will be disposed of. Koga then picks Rago up and tells him that in a few minutes he will be freed from his human prison, and then they can fuse and rule the Mononoke world. But Rago couldn't care less about ruling the Mononoke world, and even if he did want that, Koga is the last person he'd ever fuse with. Koga can't understand why Rago refuses to accept his kind gesture. But just then, Jiro grabs Koga's leg to keep him from moving, and with Koga unable to move, Reiji is able to get into position to use his special move. He unleashes a powerful slash which does some damage to Koga and forces him back, but Reiji had actually intended for that attack to split Koga clean in two, so he realizes that this is going to be a tough battle. By now, he's sure the others must have realized that they are in trouble down here, but there's no way of knowing how long it will take before they get here, so they need to work together to survive. Koga is infuriated by the fact that Reiji and Jiro actually think they stand a chance against him just because they outnumber him. He declares that first, he is going to slaughter Reiji, and he's going to leave Jiro alive for Rago's sake, but not before separating his arms and legs from his body. Koga then pulls out a sword he conjured with his blood and prepares to attack, and at the same time, back on the surface, Ryo has called for backup and currently has Tokita taking a look at the barrier the Mononoke set up. Tokita says the barrier isn't too complex, so he should be able to take it down in a few minutes tops, and since Ichika is worried about the guys down there, she offers to help to make the process go faster. Meanwhile, Ryo and Toko stand off to the side, and Toko accuses Ryo of knowing that Jiro is going to be attacked and intentionally bringing him here so they'd be forced to help. But Ryo denies it and says this wasn't planned at all. However, he isn't too worried about those two since he has faith that they are skilled enough to make it out on their own, but if anything does go wrong, he's prepared to take responsibility for it. Meanwhile, back down there, Koga is going absolutely wild on Reiji, and despite Reiji's best efforts to block the sword strike, he still gets his sword shattered and suffers a deadly blow to the gut. After he gets blown away, Jiro jumps in to stop Koga from finishing him off, but Koga blocks his punch with ease. And he even says he's disappointed because he can't believe that's the best Jiro can do with Rago's power in his body. It's a shame to see all that potential go to waste, and he promises to get Rago out of Jiro as soon as possible so he doesn't have to suffer with such an inadequate host anymore. But Jiro tells Koga to shut up already, because if he didn't already get the hint, Rago doesn't like him, and he has no intention of becoming the weapon of an idiot like him. Rago usually doesn't like people speaking on his behalf, but he completely agrees with Jiro on this, and the two of them plan to take Koga down no matter what. So Jiro channels as much of Rago's power into his fist as possible, and he then proceeds to hit Koga with the devastating blow. Jiro was sure that a punch like that would definitely be enough to defeat Koga, but as the dust clears, he is horrified to see that all it did was damage Koga's sword and injure him a little. Koga praises Jiro for finally making some good use of Rago's power since that last attack was actually decent, but just as he's about to keep fighting, they suddenly hear an explosion over by the entrance, and Jiro is confused since he has no idea what that was, but Koga can tell that it must mean they managed to get through his barrier upstairs and reinforcements are on their way here right now. Koga isn't too confident about his chances against seasoned veterans, so he decides to pack up for today and head home, and Jiro yells, calling him a coward for running away in the middle of their fight. But Koga reminds him that he could have killed Jiro at any point during the battle, and the only reason he didn't was because doing so would have killed Rago as well, so he's going to come back when he is better equipped to take Rago for himself. Shortly after Koga leaves, the reinforcements arrive, and a few minutes later, everyone is brought outside. Koga tells Ryo that there are going to be severe consequences for this since this unauthorized mission resulted in unnecessary danger and damage to the facilities. And Ryo says he's willing to take any consequences thrown at him, but he's actually satisfied with how things played out, because all else aside, Jiro and Reiji held their ground against a very powerful Mononoke, and that should be enough to convince the higher-ups that they are valuable assets to the team. He then turns to the kids and asks Reiji if he's alright since he suffered the most damage, but Reiji says he's fine. However, the only reason he's still alive right now is because the suit absorbed a large chunk of the damage. If it hadn't been for that, then he'd be dead. Ryo tells him not to think like that since they should be celebrating their victory instead, but Reiji still can't help but feel terrible because he was absolutely helpless against that guy, and he needs to do everything in his power to grow stronger. Ichika is also upset because she was absolutely useless the entire time back there, and she feels like things would have played out differently if she had just been able to break through that barrier. But there's no point in dwelling on it now. While the others are sulking, Jiro is deep in thought over the fact that before leaving, Koga mentioned something about his dad, and he has no idea what to make of it since. For as long as Jiro can remember, his grandpa has always taken care of him, so he has no idea who his real parents are, and all this confusing stuff is frustrating. But he decides he's going to keep pushing forward no matter what and give it his all to become a real part of this team. Ryo is glad to see that Jiro is in high spirits, but for the record, he tells him that he was already a full part of the team the moment he joined. That said, they all still need to learn to work together as a unit, and they each have their own individual strengths and weaknesses which they need to work on. But he wants them to know that no matter what happens, he will always have their backs. A few days later, Ryo is done with his meeting with the higher-ups about what happened, and just as he expected, he got yelled at a lot for it. But it's all water under the bridge now, so it's time for the team to move on to their next objective. And that objective is to complete a training exercise which will be conducted by a special guest. Just then, the group hears the laughter of a little girl coming from the top of the building next to them, and the girl suddenly jumps down, but no one really cares enough to bother catching her. So she faceplants into the ground. Jiro has no idea who this is, so Ryo tells everyone that this is Fuyo, and though she may not look like it, she's a Mononoke. The Bureau both monitors and eliminates Mononoke, but in some specific cases, if the Mononoke is of the friendly variety, they are allowed to live on the condition that they cooperate with the Bureau. But Fuyo wants to make it clear that she isn't simply taking orders from the Bureau, and she's here because she wants to be. She then turns her attention to Rago, and she sarcastically tells him he's a lot fluffier and cuter than she thought he would be, and Rago retorts that he's not going to take criticism from someone who looks like a tiny brat, and after that, the two start arguing. After things calm down, Ryo tells everyone to get into position so they can begin the training exercise, and he explains that this is going to be Spectral Forces suppression training. Jiro has no idea what that is, so Ryo informs him that some Mononoke are able to induce hallucinations or perform hypnosis, and it is much better to get used to that kind of thing in a controlled environment than it is to face it out in the field for the first time, which is where Fuyo comes in. Her ability allows her to create such illusions, so their task is to figure out how to break free of Fuyo's illusion by any means necessary, and that's pretty much it. Fuyo then activates her power, trapping each of them in their own custom hallucination. But Yusemi can't help but worry a little since Ryo didn't give them any actual clues on how they are supposed to free themselves from the illusion. But Ryo says it's better that way, because if they can get out of this on their own, then it means they'll be prepared for anything that happens in the field. Meanwhile, inside the illusion, Reiji finds himself in a wide open space, and he's already aware that he is trapped in a hallucination, but he has no idea how to get himself out. As he is walking through the space, he suddenly comes across a very familiar cave, and out from that cave steps someone who Reiji thought he would never see again, his brother. Reiji tries to snap himself out of it since he knows his brother is most certainly already dead, but the sword in his hand feels pretty real to him. Meanwhile, over in Ichika's illusion, she has been sent back to a memory of her childhood when her mother was still alive. Ichika had just told her mom all about how she wanted to become an agent just like her mother and father, and looking back on it now, she realizes how naive her way of thinking was back then. She thought the good guys always won no matter what, but then her mother went out on a mission and never came back. Ever since then, Ichika had done her best to train as much as she could so she could become an agent because she thought it was the only way she could feel close to her mom. But just when she thought she had it all figured out, she was informed that her mother had never actually been killed in battle like she was originally told. Instead, a Mononoke had turned her to stone, and the Bureau had been trying to use every resource at their disposal, but nothing worked. So although she is technically still alive, Ichika's mother is stuck as a statue. Ichika promises her mother that she will find a way to save her, but just then, her mother's statue starts yelling at Ichika, telling her to quit being an agent, otherwise she will end up like this too. And before Ichika knows it, the statue transforms into a monster. Similarly, in Jiro's hallucination, he is also being targeted by a monster, and he doesn't really understand how he's supposed to get out of here. But he thinks a good first step would be to take this thing down, so he and Rago prepare to fight. Reiji and his brother Shinji had always had a relatively good relationship with one another. Despite the fact that Shinji was the one who was slated to inherit the clan as the next clan head and was always slightly better than him at everything they did, Shinji still treated Reiji with love and respect, and their father never looked down on or neglected Reiji for not being as good as his brother. On the day that Shinji was meant to officially become the next clan head, he had to undergo the clan ritual, so both he and Reiji met with their father that night to prepare. As part of the ritual, Shinji must venture into the secluded cave behind their estate, where a sword which has been possessed by a powerful Mononoke has been kept, and basically grab the sword and hope the Mononoke inside doesn't take control of your body. It's not the smartest tradition, but it's their tradition nonetheless, so Shinji walked into the cave, completely alone, and though everyone was confident that he would overcome the sword as all the clan heads before him had done, the sword's strength had apparently been getting stronger over the years, so Shinji ended up losing control and attacking everyone present. And since Shinji was the most skilled swordsman of the clan at the time, no one there stood a chance against him once he had been possessed, especially not Reiji, who couldn't even beat base Shinji. Before long, the only one left alive was Reiji, but instead of killing him like the others, Shinji used the last of his control to tell Reiji to do everything he could to get stronger, and when he's confident that he can beat him, he should return to kill him. Shinji then walked off into the woods without another word, until this day. Reiji has no idea why he was left alive or how Shinji managed to retain that much control. Back to the present, Reiji is still fighting the illusion of Shinji, and Shinji tells him that it's no use because no matter how hard he tries, he is still way too weak to ever kill him. Reiji knows for a fact that this Shinji is just a figment of his imagination created by this illusion, so even if he does manage to defeat him here, it won't bring him any closer to being strong enough to defeat his real brother. He made a promise to Shinji that if he ever got himself into trouble, he would do everything in his power as his brother to help him out, and if he wants to get strong enough to do that, he can't let himself lose to a mere illusion. In one final clash, Reiji manages to slice the Shinji clone clean in half, and although this doesn't mean he has gotten any stronger, it did help remind him about what his goals are, so he's going to keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, over in Ichika's illusion, she is still facing the illusion of her mother, but while it may have rattled her a little at first, she is aware enough to realize that her mother would never say those things to her, and after that, she managed to take the monster down pretty quickly. With the monster defeated, Ichika is finally released from the illusion, alongside Reiji, and they both managed to complete the objective in under 10 minutes, which is pretty impressive. Now, the only ones left are Jiro and Rago, but Yusumi is starting to get a little worried about them, since this particular illusion works by pulling out your deepest and darkest traumas and making you face them. But Jiro and Rago don't seem like they are the type who'd be good at facing that sort of thing. And worse yet, there's no real way to know how the spell is going to react to them since Jiro and Rago are a special case. They are two souls fused as one, so the spell must be cooking up something especially troublesome for them. Meanwhile, inside the illusion, Jiro and Rago are still fighting the monster that's after them, but they haven't been able to make much progress against it since the monster is way too strong and fast for them to beat. Jiro asks what this thing is, and to his surprise, the monster actually responds, telling them that if they want to find out what it is so badly, then it will show them. The monster then transforms into a large black mass that swallows up the entire illusion scape, and outside, Fuyo suddenly opens her eyes because the situation just got really bad. Ryo asks her what happened because from what he can see, the lotus just turned black out of nowhere. So Fuyo explains that she has completely lost control of the lotus, and if she had to guess, it must have been Rago's subconscious power that caused it. As things stand now, she says there's no guarantee that Jiro and Rago will manage to make it out of there alive, since by default, the goal of this spell is to destroy the target using their darkest trauma, and now that she isn't in control anymore, she can't intervene to save them if anything goes wrong in there. Meanwhile, on Rago and Jiro's end, they find themselves in the middle of a shrine, and neither of them have any idea what this place is supposed to be, but they do notice a giant obsidian pillar, just like the one that was used to seal Rago. Just then, they see a boy walk up to the shrine and begin offering prayers at it to thank the deity for this year's bountiful harvest, and it turns out that the deity being worshipped here is actually Rago. The boy's name was Jirobe, and he would always make sure to bring Rago an offering every chance he gets. But Rago tells him he doesn't have to keep doing all this because he doesn't actually have any fortune powers, and it's not like he has actually done anything to help Greg, since this year's harvest was only so good because the weather happened to be cooperative. Even so, Jirobe tells Rago that several of the other villages in the area have been attacked by Mononoke, but no Mononoke ever decides to attack this village, and it's all thanks to Rago being here. Rago said he wasn't trying to protect them or anything, he just happened to like it here. And the other Mononoke are too scared to come near him because of the power he possesses. Be that as it may, Jirobe still told him he was glad to have Rago around, and before leaving to go back to work, he leaves Rago a little offering. As Jiro watches Jirobe walk away, he realizes that this must be part of Rago's memories, and the voice of that monster suddenly echoes out, telling him that these are specifically his memories from before he was sealed in the obsidian pillar, and it is revealed that the giant demon they were fighting earlier was actually Rago's true form. He explains that in the 1730s, when Rago was still free, all different types of Mononoke would roam around freely, and humans would have no choice but to cower in fear of them because of their immense power. A few Mononoke made themselves widely known and became revered by the people as gods, and one of those Mononoke happened to be Amagi, an old friend of Rago's. Amagi decided to pay Rago a visit today because he had something he wanted to talk about with him, and as he walks in, he notices the obsidian pillar Rago decided to put up as a decoration in his new home. He thinks it's a weird choice since death obsidian is like poison to Mononoke, but Rago said that's the whole point, because he put it up specifically to keep all the other annoying Mononoke away from here so they don't bother him. While the memory is playing out, current Rago is frozen in shock because Amagi seems really familiar to him, but he has no recollection of him whatsoever. Just then, he realizes that Amagi's voice is the same as the person who freed him from the obsidian that day, and Jiro is surprised to learn this. As the memory continues, Rago asks why Amagi would come all the way out to a remote village like this, so Amagi informs Rago that lately, humans had been intensifying their efforts to hunt Mononoke in recent years. Rago isn't too surprised by that since the Mononoke had been growing a little too overconfident, thinking humans would never fight back, but he doesn't really care since none of it is his problem. Amagi tries explaining that the situation is a lot more complicated than he thinks it is, because the humans have gotten themselves organized and created a group called the Anawaban to systematically hunt down Mononoke all across the country. Rago is a little surprised to hear that, but he asks if Amaji really came all the way out here just to warn him. However, Amaji says he actually came because he wanted to ask for Rago's help. He is currently forming his own organization to combat the Oniwaban and make sure that Mononoke remains dominant forever so they can continue their way of life of eating and killing humans as they please. He has already gathered quite a few members to support him, and if Rago agrees to join them as well, then they will be able to finally reclaim their spot at the top of this world. But Rago turns to him and tells him, "You're free to do whatever you want," but he's not getting involved because that sounds like way too much work. Amaji tries to convince him by warning Rago that if he doesn't rise up to fight against the Oniwaban now, then it's only a matter of time before they come after him instead. However, that doesn't really bother Rago much, since if they do come after him, he's more than capable of taking care of himself. The other Mononoke are outraged when they hear that Rago is refusing to join them, but Amaji simply says, "Let Rago think it over for tonight, and then he will return tomorrow to ask him one final time." As he was leaving, Rago told him he shouldn't bother coming back because the answer would still be no, but he severely underestimated just how far Amaji was willing to go to achieve his goal. The next day, Amaji did indeed return to ask Rago again, but that wasn't all he did, because on his way back, he decided to stop by the village Rago was so fond of and have a little snack, killing and eating everyone he could find. He even brought the head of that Jirobe boy up and offered it to Rago as a treat, and as expected, that absolutely set Rago off, causing him to unleash a blast so devastating that it completely leveled the mountain, along with everything in a 10-kilometer radius. Even with how powerful Amaji is, he only barely managed to survive Rago's blast, and it still cost him an arm and left him severely wounded. The only other thing that managed to survive the blast was the Pillar of Obsidian, and now that Rago has caused so much destruction, Amaji laughs because he knows once the humans in the Oniwaban find out about this, they will believe Rago was the one behind the deaths of everyone in the village and hunt him down just like the rest of them. This means Rago now has only two choices: either kill Amaji and live as an enemy to all humans, or join Amaji's cause and help him accomplish his goal. Rago realizes that neither choice is particularly good for him, since they both end with him turning against humanity because of Amaji, and if there's one thing he hates more than anything else, it's being forced to do something. So instead, he decided to go for a third option and chose to seal himself away in the Pillar of Obsidian so Amaji wouldn't be able to use his power, and the humans wouldn't have to hunt him down. That's how he ended up trapped in there for all those centuries, and he says this was Rago's way of taking responsibility for the destruction he caused. But Jiro doesn't buy the whole taking responsibility thing and thinks Rago just did it because he wanted to look cool while walking away from the whole mess. Now that he thinks about it, Rago does realize that he was pretty much running away from the mess because he didn't want to deal with it and wanted to be alone. But Jiro tells him he doesn't have to worry because unlike the old him, Rago isn't alone anymore. Rago smiles to himself, and thinking back on everything now, he admits that he has made a lot of dumb choices in his life. Jiro doesn't understand what he means, so Rago points out that the old him made a whole show of the fact that he didn't want to side with anyone. Yet after being released, the first thing he did was fuse himself to Jiro. And now, for better or worse, they are both on the same side from now on. That said, they still need to beat the monster conjured up by the illusion if they want to get out of here, so Jiro and Rago get ready to fight. Meanwhile, outside, Fuyo is still trying to do her best to break the illusion open, but nothing has worked so far. However, all of a sudden, a crack is formed on the flower, and a moment later, Jiro and Rago step out, having finally defeated the monster. After getting out, Jiro explains everything they saw in there to Ryo, and he is thrilled because he is sure the information about Amagi is going to come in handy sooner or later. The next day, Jiro and the others are watching a news report about a string of dead bodies that have been showing up in residential areas recently, and the police believe it is the work of some serial killer. But Fuyo thinks it is almost certainly a Mononoke attack, and the others agree, but then Jiro yells and asks what Fuyo is doing hanging out with them after she nearly killed him yesterday. Fuyo tells him that accident had absolutely nothing to do with her, so she can't be held responsible for it, and since Ryo is in charge of her, she is technically a member of Black Torch as well. But that gets Jiro thinking, and now he wonders why Mononoke even eat humans in the first place. After all, Fuyo is a Mononoke, yet she seems perfectly fine eating regular food, and she does confirm that Mononoke are able to eat normal food, but the reason they eat humans is because that's the only way they can level up their spiritual power. The fact that Mononoke have been launching more attacks recently is a sign that they are stocking up on power for something big, and it must have something to do with Amagi's plan. Just then, on the news, people have reported seeing a dense fog rolling in over the city which is difficult to enter or leave, which is a classic indicator of a Mononoke's presence. Ryo calls for a meeting to discuss the recent info about Amagi's involvement in all this, and given the current situation in the city, he suggests that his team should be in charge of handling it since Mononoke incidents are their area of expertise, and from what he has observed, his team will learn a lot faster from actually experiencing it in the field. After getting clearance, Ryo and the others head to the scene, and Jiro is surprised to find out that most of the people here work for the Bureau, though Ryo clarifies that for most of them, their responsibilities begin and end with the affairs of humankind. It's not surprising since there have barely been any Mononoke attacks in the past few decades, which is why most people never really notice them. And even when people are affected by Mononoke, the Bureau is usually able to handle the situation to prevent it from becoming so much of a spectacle, but this particular situation has already gotten out of hand, which is where their team comes in. The entire town of Hirosaka has been sealed off by the fog, and they know very little about the situation other than the fact that Mononoke are behind this and several civilians are currently trapped inside. The fog is dense, but their gear should be able to get them through, so once they are on the other side, they have two missions to accomplish: rescue the survivors and find a way to defuse the fog. They are also to either capture or defeat the Mononoke responsible for this by any means necessary. But Ichika is surprised that Ryo is asking them to capture Mononoke instead of kill them, but he says it is very likely that Amagi is the one pulling the strings on this, so if possible, he wants to see if he can get any leads on him by interrogating a few of the Mononoke involved. Ordinary means of communication are pretty much useless in there, so they won't be able to contact Ryo once they are in the fog, but luckily for them, they have Fuyo on their side. She uses her magic to create 3 petals for each of them, and she explains that these petals are connected directly to this lotus, and once they swallow it, it will allow them all to communicate with one another telepathically. That all sounds very useful, but the others are a little hesitant about the idea of swallowing some random petals that Fuyo made. They eventually do swallow the petals and head into the fog, and the second they are in, a Mononoke girl senses their presence and alerts her team that 3 Bureau agents have entered the barrier. The leader is a little surprised that the Bureau would send only 3 agents to deal with an incident of this scale, but he figures it will just make it easier for them to succeed. He then asks Roran how much longer it's going to take to get all the humans through the portal, and Roran says he has only gotten 200 of them so far, so they are still going to have to wait quite a while. He's honestly surprised by how long it takes to herd humans like this, since he has never put this much effort into keeping them alive before. But Kanawa says it's important to keep the humans alive so they retain their vitality. Just then, Naruko gets Kanawa's attention and tells him that there's actually one more person in the barrier, and it looks like it's that cat they've been talking about, and when he hears this, he gets a big smile across his face because he has been waiting for an opportunity to get his hands on Raigo. He asks Naruko which direction Raigo is coming from, but he doesn't get a response because she just fell asleep. Roran isn't too surprised by that since she's the one holding up the entire fog barrier, so of course she'd get tired. Kanawa asks what's going to happen if the Bureau agents find her while she's asleep like that, but Roran tells him there's nothing to worry about since they already have someone assigned to protect her. Since Naruko isn't going to be of much help here, Kanawa decides to head out to find Raigo on his own, and in the meantime, he asks Roran to stay here and continue hurting the humans. Meanwhile, Jiro and the others have just taken a quick look around town, and from what they can see, the situation isn't looking very good. They already tried waking up all the people who are lying on the ground, but no matter how much Jiro shook them, they never woke up, so the others assume they are under the effects of some kind of spell. There's no way for them to know where the Mononoke who are responsible for this are currently hiding, so Reiji suggests they should split up to start searching. But just then, Raigo wakes up from his nap, and he asks what's going on because the spiritual energy around here stinks. Ichika thinks this is perfect timing since they can use Raigo's ability to sense spiritual energy to locate the Mononoke, and Raigo doesn't mind helping, so he tries to focus. And he is able to sense 4 different spiritual energy signatures within the barrier, one that is releasing all this fog, one that is casting a spell on the humans, and 2 others who seem like fighters. However, Raigo isn't able to pinpoint their locations since the fog's energy makes it hard to sniff out. It looks like they are going to have to split up after all if they want to take down all the Mononoke, since they still don't know where they are, but just then, Jiro notices a flock of crows nearby, and that gives him an idea. He spends the next few minutes asking the crows if they have seen anything unusual lately, and all the while, Reiji and Ichika are just watching in amazement. They had heard about Jiro being able to talk to animals, but it's still really weird to see it in person. Once Jiro is done talking with the crows, he informs the others that there are 2 Mononoke in the park, and there's one on an intersection where he's gathering a bunch of humans. They plan to split up to take them down, but just then, Kanawa lands right in front of them. Jiro can tell that Kanawa is after Rago, so he tells Reiji and Ichika to let him handle this and go deal with the other Mononoke. While Jiro faces Kanawa, Ichika manages to locate Roran at the intersection where he's collecting humans, and she tells him he can either undo the spell and surrender immediately, otherwise, she will have to kill him. At the same time, Reiji has managed to locate the park where Naruko and her bodyguard are waiting, and he thinks it's lucky that the girl up there seems to be incapacitated at the moment. So he tells her bodyguard that he has the choice to either surrender or die by his blade. Back on Jiro's end, Kanawa launches the first attack, so Jiro starts jumping around, dodging all his attacks. And it doesn't take him long to figure out that Kanawa's attacks are all slow and simple, so if he simply dodges at the last second, he will have a wide opening to counterattack. Once he gets the opportunity, he unleashes Rago's power at full force in an attempt to blow Kanawa's top off. But to his surprise, Kanawa manages to withstand the attack with almost no damage, and he wasn't even taking it that seriously before. He then begins transforming, and he mocks Jiro for being a failure because he doesn't deserve to call himself a Mononoke, and he's not a human either. He then uses his gravity powers to pin Jiro to the ground and explains that he may not be the most nimble Mononoke out there, but he knows how to throw his weight around when it counts. He asks Jiro if it feels humiliating to have your face buried in the dirt like this, because this is what Mononoke have had to go through for the past few hundred years, and it's all thanks to the Bureau. Back in the glory days, Kanawa was the great demon god of a mountain, and the villagers who lived there offered him sacrifices in exchange for him protecting their land. However, when the Bureau showed up, all of a sudden, all the humans turned on him and started plotting his assassination, and the same happened to Mononoke all across the world. That's why they patiently waited for the humans to believe they had won and for the Bureau to grow complacent so they could strike back. They had initially planned to use Rago's power to their advantage, but if this sorry display is really the best Rago can do, then maybe they don't need him as much as they thought they did. While Kanawa is in the process of crushing Jiro, Roran scoffs at Ichika and asks what makes her think she can order him to surrender. Just then, Ichika leaps into the air and attempts to slice Roran's face off, which catches him off guard a little, but he manages to dodge out of the way in time. And he admits that Ichika is a lot more skilled than he initially thought she would be, but he still has a few tricks up his sleeve, so he activates his powers, trapping Ichika in an illusion that makes it seem like they are thousands of meters in the air. He tells her that though this is an illusion, his illusions are so real that if she falls from here, her brain will genuinely believe that she died, and she'll die in real life too. Roran has shown his illusions to countless people over the years and made them experience all manners of torture and pain. Also, he could enjoy watching what kind of twisted expression they make right before they die. But hearing Roran talk about humans as though they are nothing but playthings makes Ichika sick, so she tells him he's sick in the head. Roran then charges at Ichika with his spear, and though she's managing to dodge his attacks so far, she's also being pushed further and further back, so if this keeps going, she will end up falling. Just as she's about to be pushed off the edge, Ichika manages to pin Roran's spear under her arm and pull him off the tower instead, but unfortunately, since this illusion was created by him, he is able to just give himself wings to fly so he doesn't fall off. He then changes Ichika's outfit into a sailor uniform just to mess with her, and Ichika is initially embarrassed, but she realizes that Roran is just trying to get her to lose her cool so he can take advantage and knock her off, so she has to stay calm no matter what. Roran is busy thinking about how to mess with Ichika next, but all of a sudden, she activates the stealth mode on her suit, and even if Roran has control over this illusion, he can't control Ichika if he can't see her. And before he knows it, she manages to wrap her thighs around his neck to make sure he won't get away and slice his horns off, dispelling the illusion altogether. The horns of a Mononoke are what allow them to control their spectral energy, so she figured if she cut them off, Roran would lose his powers, and that means right now he is weaker than a regular human. Back on Jiro's end, he narrowly manages to avoid being squished by escaping Kanawa's grasp, leaving only his jacket, but all of a sudden, he feels like Rago's energy got a lot stronger within his body, and neither he nor Rago understand why. He recalls Rio mentioning that the Bureau suits come with spectral energy inhibitors, so he assumes that may have been limiting Rago's powers before now. But he doesn't have much time to think about it because Kanawa comes charging in again, and Rago attempts to block the attack. But instead, he ends up accidentally slicing Kanawa in half. Rago is now extremely confused because even if the power inhibitors were weakening him, taking the jacket off shouldn't have resulted in such a massive boost in power. And that's when he recalls what Fuyo said about Mononoke feeding off the vitality of humans, And without realizing it, the entire time he has been living in Jiro's body, he must have been feeding off his vitality. Over on Reiji's end, he goes silent as Naruko's bodyguard suddenly pulls out a sword to fight him, because that's the same sword that took control of his brother's body. And before he can even process what's going on, he gets speed blitzed,